Good evening and welcome to the 18th edition of the T.N. Khoshoo Memorial Award and Lecture. I'm Namrita Murli.
And I'm Anuja Malhotra, your host this evening. This year is special as we meet in person once again after the pandemic with a deeper realization of the links between livelihoods, biodiversity, and the risk of emerging zoonoses with our theme One Health. Our CEO will give us a peek into what is in store for us later tonight.
We apologize for the commotion outside and we're glad to have you all with us today. The T.N. Khoshoo Memorial Award was instituted in the year 2004 to honor the legacy of Dr. Trilokinath Khoshoo, a world-renowned environmental scientist and trustee of ATRI. So far, the award has been presented to 20 academics, practitioners, and organizations who have done pioneering work in the field of conservation and sustainable development.
A couple of housekeeping announcements before we begin the celebration. Please switch off your mobile phones or keep them in a silent mode during the event. Also, please do not hesitate to reach out to any of the volunteers in case you need any assistance. We would also like to remind our virtual guests that the microphone will be muted throughout the course of the event. And if you have any questions for the panelists, you can type them in the Q&A box and our moderator will make sure that it reaches the speaker.
I would now like to invite Dr. Bava, our founder president, who has joined us all the way from Boston to say a few words. Dr. Kamal Bava is a distinguished professor of biology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Among the many awards Dr. Bava has received, to name a few, are the first International Guneris Award in Sustainability Science, International Midori Prize in Biodiversity, and Linnean Medal from the Linnean Society. He is an elected fellow of the Royal Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. Dr. Bava, I invite you to say a few words.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, a very good evening to all. And today is a very, very special day as we celebrate the past and the present and reflect on our goals for a hopeful future. We celebrate the past as we honor the life and the work of Dr. T.N. Khoshoo, who was my teacher, my mentor, and my friend. Dr. Khoshoo, with his outstanding work in natural history, inspired me to venture into the world of plants and encouraged me to join hands with Dr. Ganesha and Dr. Umashankar to establish ATRI. Thus, Dr. Khoshoo was, in a sense, co-founder of ATRI. As a botanist, as an academic, as an able administrator, Dr. Khoshoo made significant contributions to the fields of biodiversity and sustainable development. For his distinguished work, he was awarded Padma Bhushan and the United Nations Sasakawa Prize in Sustainability. Dr. Khoshoo retired as a secretary to the Government of India in the Ministry of Environment and Forests. We celebrate the present by recognizing the work of two extraordinary individuals, Dr. Seshadri and Dr. Prasant, and of course, of Dr. Jonathan Epstein, who will deliver the Khoshoo Memorial Lecture. We will hear more about their work in a few minutes, but let me just say that these individuals show how public health is linked with integrity of nature. Such a linkage is very relevant to the situation we are facing today with the pandemic and what is in store for us as a result of climate change. Dr. Khoshoo would have been proud of the way ATRI is taking an integrated approach to the interactions between society and the environment, whether it's through our work on One Health, the planned mission on biodiversity, or restoration under the ARREST program. Finally, while reflecting on the vulnerability of our environment, we cautiously anticipate a better future as we celebrate the success of our future environmental leaders, the 4 doctoral students who received PhD degree from ATRI's Academy of Environmental Science and Sustainability Studies. A glimpse of titles of their thesis is indicative of their potential to make significant contributions to the environment and human well-being. I congratulate all these students who will be honored today. And again, Dr. Khoshoo would have taken pride in the accomplishments of our young scholars. So let me end by thanking again the organizers for giving me a few moments to share my thoughts with you. Thank you. And again, a very good evening to all of you.
Thank you, Dr. Bava, for further highlighting the legacy of the award, and Dr. Khoshoo.
We now request Dr. Nitin Pandit to come on the stage and give us a more in-depth look at this year's theme. Dr. Nitin Pandit is the CEO of ATRI, and he's guiding ATRI towards a new era as a global pioneer in conservation and sustainability. Welcome, Dr. Pandit. The stage is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this award ceremony. I'd love to say it's great to see you all here, but actually I can't see any of you here with the lights in my face. But let me just recap and set the context a little bit of this year's function. And in order to do that, let me first tell you a little bit about what I've seen of the TN Khoshoo function that has evolved over these past many years. Over the years, the TN Khoshoo function has followed themes. Every year has been a particular theme that captured the imagination of someone who actually did amazing work in that field and therefore received the award. We also broadened the theme from time to time, especially to include the social sciences and in particular also the arts. In fact, 2 years ago, right here, Jonathan Bailey from the National Geographic gave the award lecture and gave the award to Meena Subramaniam for the fantastic paintings that she makes of the Western Ghats. Subsequently, last year, of course, the world changed and everything went virtual. In fact, this facility here, only in the last 1 month, has started really coming back to life, as it were. We were rather concerned, actually, when we had this planned as to whether people will be able to come or not, and so on. And like other organizations, we thought that we would make this into a hybrid event, which is what we've done today. So first thing, for all those who made it a point to come here in person, really thank you for doing that. As we went through the pandemic last year, we had to do everything online. To make it interesting and to actually tease out a further relationship of the sciences, we actually wanted to invite someone who did work in the performing arts related to the environment. So we asked Ricky Kedge to perform for us. Those of you who saw that online probably enjoyed a little bit of music and some of the really hopeful signs that Ricky painted for us last year. And then this year now, we're able to have this hybrid event in which we are supposed to do this partly here and partly from home. In any case, as we hobble back from the pandemic, and I hope we are, as we know, we are not done yet, folks. There's still some ways to go. But the focus shifted in the world on the area of zoonotic diseases. In the world of, fake news, in the world of national and global politics and travel advisories, we sort of started wondering about what is the role of science in society. In fact, what is the role of nature and biodiversity? And in doing that, we realized that actually ATRI has a very important role to play, because in ATRI, we've always seen science that includes people so that it becomes a natural science and a social construct. So to appreciate that, we started working more and more closely on the areas of zoonotic diseases, some of which you will hear about as we go further. That research came out more and more, and we interacted with experts around the world. We were called upon to give interviews or statements and so on to try and reflect the role of science in this emergency that the world has been facing. And therefore, given that, it is of course apt to have this year's theme to be related to the One Health thematic. There's also a bigger context as far as ATRI is concerned. This is ATRI's 25th year, okay, 25 years since its founding. Very soon in February, we are going to have another function for ATRI at 25. Certainly we'll be inviting you all and a canvas of people for that function. But therefore, in that context, it is important to recognize that the annual TN Khoshoo function is continuing and will continue so that we attract the best talent and are able to award them and recognize their contributions. But in order to do that, we must also recognize the role that Dr. Bava, Dr. Umashankar, and Dr. Ganesha have played over the last 25 years, along with our board of trustees, and of course, Dr. TN Khoshoo. I think recognizing that and to keep that memory alive, we must also acknowledge the Khoshoo family, and in particular, Mr. Raj Khoshoo, who will speak with us later, for their continuing support of ATRI and the TN Khoshoo function. Finally, I want to thank our board of trustees and advisory council members and the academic advisory board members and others who may have joined us. I want to thank all the students who are, a number of them are with us today, the PhD students, and also, by the way, from this year onwards, the master students. So welcome you all for this function. I want to make sure that you get to enjoy the full width and breadth of the experience that you're about to have. So with that in mind, thank you again for joining, and let's move forward with the function.
Thank you, Dr. Pandit, for so articulately laying out the relevance and importance of this year's theme.
Dr. Pandit, could I have you back on stage in a moment?
We now begin with the Academy Alumni Felicitation Ceremony. The Academy for Conservation Science and Sustainability Studies at ATRI prepares the next generation of environmental leaders. It provides a wide range of resources and field stations for facilitating cutting-edge research on natural and social sciences to our PhD and MSc students.
We are proud to announce that this year, 4 students have graduated from Atria Academy's flagship interdisciplinary PhD program in conservation science and sustainability studies. Unfortunately, not all the alumni have been able to join us in person today for the facilitation. Some of them are, however, joining us virtually, and their supervisors and colleagues will join us on stage to collect their mementos on their behalf.
We begin with Dr. Venkat Ramanujan, whose thesis was titled Shifting Human-Nature Interactions in the Mekal Hills of Madhya Pradesh in Central India, supervised by Dr. Sharad Lele. May I request Dr. Milind Banian to join us on the stage and receive the memento. We request Dr. Pandit to please present the memento.
Next, we have Dr. Soumyajit Bar, whose thesis is titled Understanding Environmental Impacts and Drivers of Consumption in India, supervised by Dr. Sharad Lele. May I request Ms. Neha Mohanty to join us on stage and receive the memento.
Moving on, we have Dr. Amit Kurian, whose PhD thesis is titled Shifting Cultivation, Land Use Change, and Livelihood Sustainability, Causes and Consequences of Forest Agricultural Transformations in Garo Hills and Meghalaya in Northeast India. It was supervised by Dr. Sharad Lele. May I please request Shruti Samanta to join us on the stage and receive the memento.
Finally, we have Dr. Nachiket Kelkar, whose thesis was titled Riverine Ecology and Institutional Interplay, a study of conflict and adaptation in Gangetic fisheries. I request Dr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy, Dr. Kelkar's supervisor, to collect the memento on his behalf.
We would like to tell the audience that the mementos presented to the alumni are woven by the Toda community, which is an indigenous pastoralist community of the Nilgiris.
Thank you, Dr. Pandit, and our heartiest congratulations to the graduates as they now join the prestigious Atria Academy alumni. Could we have a big round of applause again for all our graduates?
Moving on, we would now like to invite Dr. Abhi Vanak, who is a senior fellow at Atri, to introduce the awardees and share a few words on their exemplary work in health access and equity for the vulnerable forest dwelling communities in the Western Ghats and the Eastern Himalayas. Dr. Vanak, over to you.
Thank you, Anuja. So I'm told I usually have a poker face, but today all bets are off because I'm ridiculously pleased and just chuffed to introduce this year's TN Khoshoo awardees. They are my colleagues and friends, Dr. Tanya Shashadri and Dr. N.S. Prashant. As mentioned previously, this year is a special year, because this year we get to recognize, it is our privilege to honor an outstanding partnership. Tanya and Prashant are partners, of course, in more than just their professions. And little Monal is here as well. So they'll shortly tell us about their journey and their shared vision. But I want to take the time to introduce them as the awesome individuals they are as well. But first, I would like to invite to the stage Dr. Darshan Shankar, who who's the Vice Chancellor of the Transdisciplinary University. Please. I'd also like to invite to the stage Dr. Nitin Pandit. I would now like to invite to the stage our awardees for this year, Dr. Prashant and Dr. Tanya Sheshadri. So now that I've brought them on stage, they're going to all have to stand and be a little bit uncomfortable because I'm going to really praise them. So, let me start with Tanya. Dr. Tanya Sheshadri has been with the Vivekananda Girijana Kalyana Kendra, VGKK, BR Hills, since 2012. She was instrumental in setting up the Tribal Health Resource Center at VGKK and is involved with overseeing the hospital and community health program, catering to the Soliga and other Adivasi communities in Chamarajnagar district. The center is also involved in participatory and collaborative research in maternal and child health, sickle cell disease, and other blood-related diseases, zoonotic diseases, and in generally addressing other health problems among Adivasi communities. She is a faculty member of the Institute of Public Health, Bengaluru, since 2020, and is currently co-leading the establishment of a multi-institutional research and training center for action on tribal health called the Center for Training, Research and Innovations in Tribal Health under an award from the DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance. Apart from her work in Chamarajnagar, she was also involved in setting up community health initiatives at the Christian Institute of Health Science Research in Dimapur, Nagaland, and in strengthening the health systems initiatives at the district level in Tumkur. She was also a consultant in the Health Equity Research Initiative in India, implemented by the Achyuta Menon Center for Health Science Studies at the Sri Chitra Tirunal Institute of Science and Technology, Trivandrum, since 2017. She has consulted on different short-term research on maternal health innovations, urban health and wellness centers, and community health workers with leading international and national organizations. Dr. Prashant Srinivas is a public health researcher with experience in working in primary healthcare and community settings in southern Karnataka. He started his career as a medical officer with VGKK in BR Hills from 2003 to 2007, after which he left for his master's in public health and later on for his PhD. He has since, of course, returned to the BR Hills and enviously he lives there. He has worked at the intersections of healthcare and health systems, with ecological and social systems, with a particular focus on health inequities and social determinants of health. He leads the Health Equity Cluster at the Institute of Public Health, Bangalore. Since 2014, he lives and works at a public health research field station in BRT Tiger Reserve, and is also helping set up a planetary health research field station, a planetary health information center at the Pake Tiger Reserve in northeastern India through collaborations with local communities and other ecologists. He served as the chair of the Emerging Voices for Global Health and is a member of the General Council of the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp in Belgium. He's also a well-published author with several publications in international peer-reviewed journals. Through a fellowship from the DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance, he has also set up collaborations to examine health inequities in indigenous communities in multiple remote forest locations in southern, central, and northeast India. He's part of research consortia on health system strengthening for One Health and mental health in primary healthcare. He's also been a champion of open knowledge and continues to contribute actively to the English Wikimedia Commons, Internet Archive, and various other open knowledge and open data projects. During the last year, of course, they've been really busy. Okay, and they've been on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. During the second wave, as we saw, many rural districts in Karnataka were really badly hit. Both doctors specialized in public health, they dived straight in. Noting the lack of primary healthcare level preparedness when COVID-19 was first reported in India, they led the COVID-19 Primary Healthcare Action Group with several leading rural public health professionals to come up with the first of its kind PHC checklist resource for COVID-19 care. During the second wave, when the COVID-19 was at its peak, they joined the district hospital triage team on the ground and worked when the hospital was overwhelmed with patients, directly providing patient care, as well as organizing smooth workflow and triage systems. On the request of the district administration, they led a team of doctors and public health professionals from the Institute of Public Health and VGKK and facilitated setting up of such triage units in Taluka hospitals. Dr. Tanya also led an extensive community engagement strategy for COVID-19 care when positive cases appeared in remote Adivasi settlements in Kollegal and Hanur. Based on their collaborative engagement with the district administration, Zilla Panchayat and DHO, the state's first Adivasi community-based COVID care center was set up in Girijana Ashrama Shale in Jirigadde, Podu in Chamarajnagar. Currently, with support from the Azim Premji Foundation, Dr. Tanya Sheshadri is working closely to improve vaccination coverage in tribal areas through vaccination promoters from the Adivasi community and in partnership with the Soliga Abhiruddhi Sanghas. In fact, I'm really happy to see that some members of the Sanghas have also come here to take part in this amazing felicitation. Nearly 80 Adivasi hamlets of the Soliga, Jenu Kuruba, and Beta Kuruba communities have individually been covered, and vaccination rates are improving in hamlets where this team has been performing the now famous Corona Mari Nritya Nataka, followed by dialogues with the community on importance of vaccination. Under the Chaitra project, Dr. Prashant now leads a team of public health researchers who are working to establish an early warning system and seroprevalence estimation study. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Darshan Shankar to award the 2021 TN Khoshoo Award to Dr. Tanya Sheshadri and Prashant. Thank you, Dr. Darshan Shankar. Thank you, Dr. Nitin Pandit. I would now like to invite Tanya and Prashant to talk about their incredible journey and tell us about their work a little in their own words. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Avi, and thank you, Atri, for literally putting us in a spotlight. I would like to say that I think I would like to believe that we did extraordinary work. But frankly, I mean, this is not some attempt at self-deprecation or sort of a humility that is needed at award ceremonies. But frankly, looking back, we were discussing what shall we say, for what achievement are we being awarded. And I think if I look back, all I can think of over the last 2 years at least has been things that ought to have been done, and things that do not perhaps require the greatest of scientific sophistication, things that do not require the highest degree of scientific excellence and knowledge. These were more or less things that ought to come very easily, I think, things that human beings in various professions, dived in during the pandemic. But I can see why it is so important that we choose to gather and respect those kind of things, which is this kind of responding to a pandemic. And I believe it is because we see so few examples, even within the public health community, of really meaningful engagement where achievements happen through large collective action. And I think increasingly over the last decade, what I have experienced is the quest for extraordinary individuals over large collective actions, and I think that's really increasing. So for me, I mean, I'm rambling somewhat, but for me, I think what I take back from this recognition that A3 bestows on us is that I think it honors a coming together of a very large number of people, some of whom are here today. I mean, Abhi mentioned the Corona Mari Nritya. I don't know how many of you have seen that remarkable innovation that did not come out of an NIH grant or a DBT grant. It came out of that person there, Basavaraju, a folk artist who, and all we did is, because the highest degree of evidence did not tell us how is it that we can convince communities who do not have road when their pregnant women have to deliver, they do not have respectful maternity care, there is no piped water to their settlements, how to convince them, and no one among them whom they know have died of COVID, how do you convince them that the vaccine will save your lives? You know, so it's also in fact naive and foolish, we thought at that time. Of course, respecting the need for convincing. I'm not suggesting that there is no need to something. Yeah, sorry, my daughter is leaving. Yeah, so it was really not about what evidence is needed, but it was really how do we practice our evidence. So I think in some sense, the partnership with Basavaraju, the partnership with the Jilla Budakattu Girijana Abhivrudhi Sangha, whose president C. Mahadev is also here today, these partnerships taught us that what is at the heart of what we need today is not just scientific knowledge, but transformational knowledge that can help us together advance and move. And the transformational knowledge we realized, I mean, it's maybe for effect, I'm saying we realized, it wasn't like one day I realized, but I think over time, what was very obvious is that the transformational knowledge has to be done through dialogue, long conversations. It's really slow cooked food. When in fact, I think increasingly universities and institutions are moving towards fast food. I'm speaking in metaphors, of course, with these, quick grants, high impact science, and things like that. So to cut a long story short, I think what I wanted to say is that I would like to believe that this award honors a new way of doing science, where science is happening through very large number of coalitions, collaborations, collectives, and science also happens through new people who generate questions. There's a lot of people like me who have always asked interesting research questions. There are so few, for example, Adivasi people who are also PIs and scientists today. Perhaps the questions they would ask if they would receive research grants would be very different. Growing up at the edge of a forest, for example, the kind of One Health research that could happen when an Adivasi researcher asks a question as to what should intersectoral action on One Health look like in Purani or in Bedaguli, perhaps the answers they will come out with will be very different, even if the methods they use are the same. So with that sort of a slight abstraction, perhaps I hope in Tanya's remarks, she might cover some of the work that we did. But thank you very much, A3. And thank you very much for many of you who made a choice to come face to face. I know traveling in BR Hills for us is very enjoyable. I can't say the same to come from Tata Nagar or from Judicial Layout to Indira Nagar. Going from Purani Podu to BR Hills will be an enjoyable drive. It's not the same. I know many of you made that journey today. Thanks a lot, those of you who came. And among the audience is my father and mother, who also I would like to thank. And particularly, I would like to thank a few colleagues from BR Hills, C. Mahadev, Basavaraju, C. Mahadev Gowda, of course, who is very well known at A3, Nagesh and others who came. Thank you.
Yeah, let me start by saying thank you. And I think one of the challenges we face often is that we work together so often. We've already said what the other was planning to say. So I have to come out with something. But yes, I think one thing that we both agree on is this we take this award and this felicitation, I mean, with great humility, a little bit of awkwardness, not used to standing here, but also because I think in the landscape that we have been working in for the past decade, it's very evident that there are few people who are indulging in research or talking across sectors or organizations. But unfortunately, even though we are fewer, we are often the more heard. Whereas you have community members, you have people in grassroots organizations like VGKK, where I work, who have been there more in numbers talking, but often people, they aren't getting these kind of opportunities. And with COVID, of course, that was something we realized in Chamarajanagar during the second wave, because of, it was becoming everyday crisis. We were completely into COVID. But suddenly the way people from different departments came together, we also read about it a lot. All of you must have witnessed it in Bangalore. Different people coming together. Suddenly there was no department, administration boundaries, and everyone was getting to health. In Chamarajanagar, we had IFS officers who did a fabulous job of oxygen management, bed availability, etc. So you saw people coming together, and it was our, that was our team. District officials, community members, administrators, policymakers, all in the same room, all starting to say, how do we talk the same language? And I think that along with friends, collaborators on social media, also, of course, partners from A3, the whole team just jumped in and said, and we were like, are you sure Chamarajanagar, we're far? And it wasn't, everyone was in it. And much of the work actually, I feel, is the work of that collective. The community that we work with, it's over the years, the lines have blurred. I think, today the community we work with are our neighbors, our friends, my daughter's teachers, her friends, her parents. So then we have, co-parents complaining over, schools and other things. And today, many of them are also co-researchers, co-investigators in the projects we do. And actually, that's the sort of work that today we are recognizing. It's tougher, to do that kind of work, but that's the work that's making more and more sense, because that's more owned. It isn't any one, you're not looking for outcomes like improved, maternal mortality or, some number that will impress someone. You're looking at partnerships and building systems that will hopefully sustain for the next coming years. And I think that's the one thing I just wanted to say here. I think we stand here and, we may be visible, but the work that we do is definitely work with a huge team. And we're so fortunate to be working with largely the tribal people of Chamarajanagar, the Solika community, and also the Jilla Budakattu Girijana Abhivriddhi Sangha, who have been also our guides, also our critiques. And thank you for that also. And so I guess I would like to accept this award also in behalf of all the people that we work with. Unfortunately, due to COVID, many could not come here, but we will take back all that we hear, all the messages also back to them. Thank you so much.
Yes, take a seat. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Tanya and Prashant. Well, we'll move on to the next part of this evening. I would also now like to invite on stage Dr. Vijay Chandra. Dr. Vijay Chandra is the founder of Strand Life Science and is also an adjunct professor at the Indian Institute of Science. Please welcome. No, it's okay. I think it's on. Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to have a little conversation amongst friends and colleagues, and we're going to discuss some of these things that we've just heard about and expand this a little bit more as well. So we've just heard about Tanya and Prashant's amazing work. So maybe I'll start with you, Chandra. Could you please describe to us the role of the work that you do in furthering the field of One Health and the framework in general?
Thank you. It's certainly wonderful to be here and also be with the awardees tonight. I think their work is exceptional. I'm basically a computer scientist by training, and have worked in various aspects of data science applied to health. Right? And so, of course, you mentioned Strand as part of the journey that I've been on, and at Strand, of course, we've had a very interesting and important project that has been done in collaboration with A3 and several other agencies. And for the last, I guess, 12, 13 years now, the India Biodiversity Portal was developed by my colleagues, Dr. Prabhakar and the team, and that has been an extraordinary, documentation and an open data approach to actually documenting biodiversity. And I believe that it's one piece of what we're going to need as we build towards One Health. The same team also got together a couple of years ago to think about collecting health data directly, various types of health data, which could then overlay with the ecology, data. And of course, that's the kind of integration that we're talking about in this One Health concept. And I think, Abhi, you are a co-author also on the paper and on building the portal, which we've called the Health Heat Map of India. And basically, we have integrated various public health data sets that are available, and of course brought them together on a platform where you can actually visualize and also analyze data that can be regional, it can be regarding specific populations. And because the National Family Health Surveys and the IDFS databases and so on have been integrated, you can also study various health-related parameters. It's an ongoing effort. 2 years is still, an early stage for that platform, but it has the potential to develop into what might eventually be a good health, One Health platform for the country to work with. So, this is the kind of work that's been going on. Of course, I, at the Indian Institute of Science for the last 4 years, I've also taught, I introduced a new course in digital epidemiology, and it's using, biostatistical modeling, of course, the classical epidemiological models, but also bringing in data science concepts. For example, agent-based modeling and various large network representations to represent how diseases spread and so forth. And the students, many of the students who have taken those courses, of course, were when the pandemic actually happened, were prepared and actually did some very interesting modeling exercises. But we can get into more details. But that course is now being expanded because I think because of the pandemic and the interest today that you have in epidemiology. On a lighter vein, I think when you walk into a bookstore now and ask for books on epidemiology, they'll send you to the self-help section, right? So, so I think the course has been expanded now. Next spring will be a 4-credit course. We expect a lot of students from EE and computer science to sign up at IISc. So the Dean, Rajesh Sundaresan, and I will be co-teaching the course next year. So, yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much. I'll just move back a little bit and ask Tanya and Prashant, and you're welcome to chip in as well. But, so there's recently the comedian Veer Das was heavily trolled in the social media for talking about the idea of 2 Indias. And we see that we saw this happening during the pandemic as well. Okay, of course, everybody suffered, but some suffered a lot more than others. And we saw this again during the second wave when when you guys were leading the effort in Chamarajanagar. I think when Monal wants to join the conversation. I think better. So I just quickly wanted to ask, so I wanted to ask you then is that this 2 Indias idea, how does it work out on the field? When you are working with communities that are fairly inaccessible, even by rural standards. How do you bring some of this together eventually?
Yeah, I think 2 may be too small a number, right? Maybe in Chamarajanagar alone, we may have some 200 Indias there. I think maybe talking about it is not allowed or something. But I just, if you allow me, I'll just go to this story that you mentioned about Jirge Gadde during our inauguration. It was the state's first, in Chamarajanagar, we started the state's first community, Adivasi Karuna Seva Kendra, which was managed and monitored by the Jilla and Taluk Soliga Abhiruddhi Sangha in partnership with the Gram Panchayat and supported by the health workers at the periphery, unlike the other institutional quarantine centers that were set up. And how that played out was that in Chamarajanagar, as the crisis was getting stabilized, the question started coming about, okay, community. COVID is coming from the community, so can we screen them earlier? Can we? And that's when the mandatory institutional quarantine rule came in. But that's when we also started seeing reports in the media about, media reporting saying tribal people running away into forest when anyone comes to talk about COVID. And this didn't sound very much true about the kind of places that we worked with. So on one of the visits that we were on with some of the community leaders and the Panchayat CEO, we came across this family where half of them had been diagnosed as COVID positive, and they were saying you have to go to the institutional quarantine, and they were refusing. So it was a slightly hostile situation there. And then you had the Panchayat, you had the the entire administration, the COVID captains, teachers, Panchayat members, and the CEO's entourage. So you have the police, everyone there, and everyone surrounding this one tribal man, Soliga man, saying you must go for institutional quarantine, as if he doesn't get it. But actually, when we were I was listening, we heard that he was saying that I'm happy to go for quarantine. I don't want to be relocated to a faraway area or an unfamiliar area. Have the center in my village, and I will happily go, and I'll take my family also. And that's and then we had to sort of pause the way the aggression, and it was just getting worse and worse. We'll bring a policeman, we'll forcefully take you. And then we had to, butt in and say, there is something to this, the history of relocation two Adivasi communities. Let's try to talk about, you have to remember all the threads. You can't just focus on one thread. And then they agreed, and there was a huge circle, and all the different actors sat together and we spoke about it. And that's when they realized that we had to start the first Adivasi Karuna Seva Kendra, and we had 30 people come in, children, women, pregnant women, men, just walk in, get admitted, finish their quarantine and leave. And this was during the district task force meetings. This was the other India that they were talking about, oh, education, oh, reach, oh, access. But actually, I think sometimes when we're talking about the different Indias, I think it's about having different kinds of conversations. It's not about treating people, I mean, it's not about trying to sensationalize things. It's just about how what we all know, right? Like even in research, we know that it's so difficult to come up with that one sentence in the conclusion, because you have so many different findings that make sense in so many different contexts. And that's what I would say, that yes, we do have many, many different Indias in one place, and working with the tribal community, I have learned to stop relying so much on, one solution, majority solution, start understanding the different contexts, and then work with them to have those different solutions. Sorry if I went into.
No. This is fantastic. I mean, and Prashant, okay, go ahead and say what you want to say, and then I'll ask you another one.
No, I just wanted to say, I mean, this thing of, I completely agree that I think we're talking of really many Indias. But I think if you go back to your question on why is it, I don't know what many of the colleagues from the Solika community who are here think, but is it really distance that is creating a hurdle in delivering services in a day and age where we are talking of the power of technology? How come technology too has not been as transformative as it has been promising? I mean, you remember the telemedicine revolution, 2001, 2, 3, people were talking like in few years, everyone in remote India will all have a telemedicine successful consult. We are still figuring out what is a good way, despite the pandemic, what is a good quality telemedicine consult like. So I think, I mean, to cut a long story short, I think it has also to do with what do we problematize. In this case, I think it's not the distance. There's a lot of issues around governance, intent, and also how do you do things? If you want to provide respectful care in a remote community, what do you problematize and how do you do it? I think we have not gotten down to sort of co-producing those kind of models. And I think the solutions are there.
So I'm, something that Tanya just said, and then I heard it again from you, is listening to different voices. And then you said it again when you were giving your speech that, if you had a different perspective on research from, say, the One Health perspective. So if an Adivasi scientist asked that question, but let me ask you that question on behalf, being the voice, if you may, what does, in the place that you are in, situated where you are, and from the perspective, now that you've seen the perspective, and now you've also been involved with a couple of large projects that have looked at it from the co-production perspective. What does the One Health framework mean to you where you are in terms of not just zoonotic diseases, but in general in terms of healthcare?
Maybe I'm being a bit, maybe purposely I'm being a bit cynical here, not only of One Health, but perhaps of many such frameworks. I think these frameworks are very powerful, very important, and they're very well intentioned. But I believe we do not still know how to practice them meaningfully in the very many contexts. You call it many Indias or many contexts. Take, for example, I mean, there has been so many things. They use the phrase wicked problems, for example. That's one framework. So many others. Take, for example, climate change. How we often ask, okay, climate change, let's go and educate people. I often hear on social media, oh, so many people still don't know about climate change. No, let's go and educate them. I think predicated underlying this thing is the is the understanding that we know what has to be done. And then it's the problem of communicating it to other communities who either for the sake of illiteracy or for some other reason do not know. So I really think all frameworks, be it One Health, be it planetary health, for example, is another interesting framework. All of these frameworks need to hit the ground. And when they hit the ground, I feel we need to listen. We need to share. Sometimes we'll get laughed at potentially. Sometimes we might find very interesting solutions. For example, the Corona Mari solution that we got, I think was an example of sitting in a group and saying, okay, now how do we communicate pandemic ideas, including, for example, Basavarajo in his song, for example, talks about its origin in China without stigmatizing or claiming that this is somehow the Chinese people who have sent the virus. So the messaging, how do you also weave that into folk dances and practices is something I would not have been able to do, even if I spend an entire PhD program on that. So I think frameworks like One Health, while they leverage the power of science and technology, they must also leverage the power of equitable participation, not just as, we involved a large number of people to conduct surveys, but involving a large number of people shaping the One Health practice, not gathering data for One Health.
Thanks. Chandra, just picking up from that thread, when we are talking about the role of technology and data and science, could you maybe share with us an example of where you think that this, where One Health hits the ground? How do we take that science? How do we take this high level analysis and bring it down to earth so that it has impact on local communities in the way that, Tanya and Prashant are talking about? Anything specific?
Sure. I think to begin with, let's all acknowledge that public health in this country is broken, right? I think, there is a lot to be done, right? So I'm also a commissioner with the Lancet Commission, where we're trying to think through what it would take to reimagine India's health system. And so we could actually move towards universal healthcare by 2030. Right? And I actually co-chair the technology work stream within that. So, you really have to start pretty much at the beginning, right? We're almost, we've almost destroyed our primary healthcare system. So we need to actually think about how technology can re-energize a citizen-centered view, right, of healthcare. And that has to begin with actually thinking about journeys like what you've been describing, and then seeing how technology could play a role in that, right? So you talked about telemedicine. I think that is certainly one of the vehicles, and it's clear that the pandemic in some ways has accelerated the adoption of technologies like that. I think devices, portable devices, point of care, diagnosis, many technological opportunities are there that can actually go down to citizen-centered view. We should also take a provider-centered view where we've been primarily focused on using technology at very tertiary care levels. We have to think about how to leverage technology to empower the A&M or the community health worker to actually be able to provide better care, right? And I think it's a great opportunity. I think from the point of view of One Health, of course, we also have now this new awareness around zoonosis and how damage to our ecology can actually trigger major events like the COVID pandemic. And so, we have to learn to again be alert. I mean, the ICMR, sentinel sites and, the 30 odd sites that were established, as we know, has played a very good role now and then, right? The first incidence of the Nipa crisis in Kerala was actually caught very early, right? And the public health intervention was done well. And that, from what I understand, it was the ICMR Sentinel site that Dr. Arun Kumar ran that actually flagged that. And I think, those are all great stories. And I think we should be really building on them. Just one thing that technology could have done, and I just throw this up there, is that we had this deadly second wave, right? And which of the pandemic, and India actually did very well to call out the Delta virus very early. Right? The INSACOG work at IGIB in Delhi and so on called out that variant, but we didn't do enough genomic surveillance. If we were doing adequate genomic surveillance in the month of February, we would have seen that the Delta variant was growing at 10x. We're only seeing that now retrospective. But if we were doing that surveillance back in February, we would have known that there is something happening. All your epidemiological models would have had to reflect this new transmissive variant, and we would have known that something, major is coming, and we could have been much better prepared. So, that capability was there, but we were not organized well enough. Now we are able to turn around this genomic surveillance within a week. For example, we do about 500 samples a week of just Bangalore positive cases. So now we are starting to understand what variants are coming, how they're coming, and hopefully we are alert and ready. But this is there are so many things that technology can do and can help, but we need to be better organized for that. But I think the most important thing from a general health perspective is we need to really think through these citizen-centered, provider-centered, and and do something really to improve our primary care. Right? So,
if I may pick up on this, while I completely get the need for investments in genomic surveillance, which is all very needed, I don't think it's a question of choosing whether to invest in technological One Health kind of solutions versus socially equitable just One Health solutions. And there's both. On the other side, for example, we were talking about the Chamarajanagar instance, a district hospital that got overwhelmed during a pandemic. All Bangaloreans are very familiar with how hospitals got overwhelmed. The quality of care in district hospitals today, where a majority of our citizens seek care, is appalling. And I think that not many people will disagree with that. And what outraged us, I think many of us in the COVID-19 pandemic, is because a lot of the upper socioeconomic groups had to interface with the government system, whether they liked it or not. And suddenly it was a very big issue. So I think at the heart of what Chandru was talking about, the universal healthcare model and primary healthcare, is the softer elements, which are not so technology prone, like quality of care, respectful care, dignified care. And with many Adivasi communities, the reason why vaccine is not being embraced like gung-ho is also because previous experiences with our health services have been dismal, and none of us would like to go to a hospital for being chastised or insulted, etc. So I think both the technological aspects and these softer aspects, which are not amenable easily to sort of high quality evidence, but need more praxis. We need, for example, We need many more building caring nursing practice, building caring pharmacy practice. A lot of that stuff, and a lot of it is very boring, frankly. We can't have, a very interesting scientific discussions about this, but that's also at the heart of this conversation. So let me then broach the subject of, and this I'm sure can go on all evening long, but if you had to highlight three things, Chandru said the public health system is broken. This is a conversation I remember Prashant and I having many months ago, and we were looking for public health minded people to work with us. So Prashant mentioned, respectful care is a missing element. But if you had to fix the public health system, because I know, in fact, even when we were talking about the Bangalore or the Karnataka COVID committee that was set up, you were very critical of that committee because it was severely lacking in public health professionals. So if you had to suggest, say, maybe three things, or you can do 10, I'm sure, but what would that be? What would that look like?
Okay, maybe you can call me the optimist in the group. I guess the way I've been working in the community for the last couple of decades, I I come from the community health grassroots side, and I don't think the system is broken, because that assumes that there was a system or abhi toot gaya, right? I think we have constantly been building the system, right? And often we have gotten distracted. Okay, everyone wants to do HIV program. We did one HIV program. Then you had this health workers and someone said integrate. Then you integrated without knowing what really it entails. Like some of the mixed methods work that I was initially involved in many years ago, where it's mixed methods, but quant guy will do quant stuff, qual person will do qual stuff, report, everything will be copy pasted in one document, So I think we've been building a system, and I am fortunate, I think, that I've been trained and working in the rural part of India, where this system has been incrementally moving ahead. Whereas many of you all are in the urban areas where no one has ever really tried to build an urban health system. It was always assumed that, city people will take care of themselves, municipality, you will figure it out. And we are fortunate in the rural side. We have panchayats, with the National Health Mission, we have a decentralized approach, etc. So yeah, so first just that clarification. What is needed? Again, yes, the list goes on, I think, but for the work that I've been involved in, the few things, like for instance, we spoke about technology, right? I think the equity lens goes a little beyond only about throwing money at solutions, right? It's also about, for instance, how we look at data, how we look at work, for instance, yeah? Like the area where I work, so difficult to take time to write a paper, so easy to just go out into the field, right? But then the system that I work in doesn't appreciate, field work is only for those months, and outputs are measured by publications, right? So I think it's the way system views it. So when we talk about technology in I also work with Karuna Trust, which has been doing a lot in primary healthcare. Technology, when we talk about, often the conversation goes into something cutting edge. It's always cutting edge method, cutting edge excellent, something new, something forward. But then the area we live in, a computer is not available for a youth or anyone to just go and, open and see how to turn on and turn off. Even like, many of my patients, many of the women that are in my neighborhood only know how to return a call when received or redial. Even the numbers are not there. So I think when you talk of technology, I think the thing for me is to try and bring equity into any and every work that we do. Because yes, in Bangalore, things are at another level, but then in Chamarajanagar also, there's a lot to be done in technology. We only don't need to be, in a lab to be doing that. And the same, I would say, applies also to data. Data is something that we really struggled with in COVID also. when you ask our district health officers or others, how many, let's say, okay, how many mothers have had antenatal coverage as per WHO guidelines? They'll immediately tell you 87%, 90%, whatever the number is. You ask them how many tribal mothers, and they don't know. I mean, they'll say, we'll talk to people, and that's because the system doesn't, this is so much better. The system doesn't allow that variable. A mother in the health information system is an ANC woman. All ANC women are ANC women, that's it. Antenatal care women. We tend to abbreviate a lot in the health sector. So the district officer doesn't know. And the problem is, once he doesn't know how many tribal mothers, what's the antenatal coverage like amongst tribal mothers, then he doesn't see the problem. And then when he doesn't see the problem, he's not doing things to fix it. So a huge issue for me is, I think, data. The second is, like, for working in tribal health, we're always going back to NFHS surveys. And they're happening, what, a decade one survey. And the way, the way sampling happens is not really representative of what the situation is, especially in a state like Karnataka, where the tribal people's numbers, first of all, within ST itself, there are all these different communities. You've got the Adivasi ST, you've got other ST who are not Adivasi. And then when you're saying, okay, among Jain Kurubas, what's the nutrition situation, right? We don't know. We don't have numbers. Neither is the system collecting it, nor are these large surveys doing it. So I think equity, lens or framework into this. And sorry, the third thing, because you mentioned One Health there, was going data across systems. Because tribal welfare department has a lot of data, right? You've got the GIS, who is the department with GIS? There's some remote sensing, some department was there. They have all the data, boundaries, all that. But then you have health department. And then they are not, how do you share data across? It's not allowed, or it's not possible, at least from what I have seen, is it's because you have to send an application and then you have to tell them exactly what you want, but then so there are all these procedures. I think even that intersectoral collaboration, you may bring everyone to the table, but what will it actually mean to be able to just get data from everywhere together? I think that will make things a lot easier. So these are the three things. Thank you.
Thank you. Vijay, you've heard some of these challenges. What would you suggest as if you had to give 3 solutions? And I know training, because you're also on the teaching side. What would you suggest would be the three big fixes?
Well, I think as far as data is concerned, I do believe that there is technologically no reason why this data can't be shared and put together. I think we need, for example, some of the foundations like Gates, which does a lot of field work, and their grantees to work in health-related topics. When the data has to be collated and put together, they tend to bring in academics from the West, right, to actually carry out the studies, because in some sense we have not paid attention to building the right tools. There's some very easy ways to do that, but we just have to, I think, invest in creating the right tools and infrastructure to be able to do that. And that was our entire reason for starting out this health heat map work, because ultimately we want to be able to pull this together. I just saw a very detailed study, for example, on nutrition and undernutrition that S.V. Subramaniam has from Harvard has put together. So he's able to get the data, right? It's pretty amazing because I think it's probably the most complete data analysis that I've seen. So I think I think it would be good to focus on pulling together better information so that you can make more considered choices. I think on this question of actually delivering better services to the citizen. I do think we will need a fair amount of rethinking about our institutions. I think Alma Ata was declared. The declaration was in 1978, right? And the whole idea was that it was going to be primary healthcare that would deliver us to universal healthcare. That I think that focus has to be brought back. Right? And then that's where I started with saying that we need to rethink how we do primary healthcare. I think the other aspect that I think of as could be helpful in having more effective One Health or public health perspectives would be that we perhaps need to think a little more or work a little bit more towards really at a constitutional level, why is health not a fundamental right in the country? It is still not a fundamental right. Our leaders will tell you that it is a fundamental right, but deep down, of course, legally and constitutionally, it is not a fundamental right. And if we were to actually make such an amendment to the Constitution the way we have for education, we could perhaps see a lot more happening. And Kailash Satyarthi, actually, I don't know how many of you saw that, but wrote an op-ed on this not too long ago in the Hindu, and saying it's finally time now, right, to call out health, right to health as a fundamental right, and I think politically that may be an important step towards making agencies more responsible. So it's not really a technological fix. I really think it's a political fix that's needed.
Prashant? Yeah. Actually, recently the Indian Academy of Sciences had organized a very nice panel. It was a wonderful panel. I think among them was also Gautam Menon, I think, put it together, and Prabhat Jha, who led this million death study, made some amazing points. The largest data available to us today is our routine data. We do not need surveys. There is a huge amount of birth and death registration, the civil registration system, CRS data. And it is so bad. It is so bad. And not for lack of technology. Like many of the problems I think the public health people are posing today, I think Chandru will agree, it's not like we don't have the technology for it. We do not seem to have the vision to implement it and really the praxis that needs to sustain it. Take the births and deaths. If we had a good CRS, civil registration system, we would not have been in this politicized mess on, okay, did UP have high deaths or did Kerala have low deaths? Which state performed better? It would have been a matter of data journalism. So data journalism is so tough in India today because you do not have routine data which is out there with citizens so that they can then demand accountability. So then accountability also becomes a matter of political opinion, right? So I think if going back to your question, I think what we must fix is indeed our data systems with an equity focus. And the second thing is something that has been pending for a very long time, creating a public health cadre. He spoke of institutional changes, and I think that's very important because I think we often locate a lot of problems on individuals, again, on knowledge elements, educating the poor or the tribal or the marginalized, as if these are the errant players who are messing up our public health. Whereas the elephant in the room is our structure. We don't have, for example, even today, a district health apparatus which is trained in public health in the pandemic year. So if you have a district health stewardship which is public health trained, they would then be open to One Health and planetary health, and then they would probably be your inner champion inside the system to actualize sentinel surveillance, to create a more cross-sectoral conversation. But what do we have instead is specialists. You might have an ENT specialist or an anesthetist after 10, 15 years of service in the government who is a district health officer. And then he or she is then in charge of organizing healthcare during pandemics, population health, epidemiology, etc., which are not skills that have been trained. So there are some very fundamental institutional changes that we need to do in order to learn the right lessons moving forward.
So, everything I'm hearing from you making me slightly concerned and perhaps a little despondent about how we bring One Health into a system, well, which is either broken, or if I go optimistically, we're still building. If you're still building, then I can, maybe there's a ray of hope there that we can build these elements into it. Because, the fundamental problems, I mean, if things are so bad in the public health sector in terms of data gathering and data access and, crosstalk, we know that in the veterinary and veterinary field, it's pretty bad. The ecological field is non-existent, especially in terms of the wildlife health side of it. The interdisciplinary nature of it is completely missing. As you said, there's nobody there to champion that because I suppose nobody's seen the value of it. So, in that circumstance, I'm just going to open this to all three of you and say, give me some hope.
Okay, let me take that forward. One of my first mobile visits in Biati Tiger Reserve area was I was trying to, this community doctor, trying to understand, trying to ask broader questions there. And one of the elders there, one of the women elders, spoke about she was sort of giving me very mean looks. I was trying to talk about maternal health, but then, in the health system, in health services, when we say mother, we mean only from pregnancy till 6 weeks of conception. After that, you're a woman, you're not a mother. And she was getting very confused because for her, mother is only after you have a child and you're always a mother. So we were having those kind of conflicts. And she finally paused and she was explaining about how can we be healthy. And she spoke about the importance of the forest. And she spoke about the importance of the forest being healthy, not trees and numbers and things like that, but the importance of the biodiversity, why you need different kinds of plants, etc. And then she also spoke about the importance of the wildlife, why they have to be there and they have to be healthy. And she was explaining that only if the forests are healthy and the wildlife are healthy and the people are healthy, will we all be healthy. If you try to remove any one factor, or if any one is unhealthy, like, try to get rid of the wildlife or try to get the people off, then this harmony that exists in the environment wouldn't be there anymore, and it would everything would collapse or everyone would become unhealthy. So maybe it was her One Health framework that someone else wrote a PhD on and brought it out, but the community, the framework of health amongst the indigenous people is, for me, I mean, at least from what I have, for what little I have been engaging and learning about One Health, is the spirit and the vision of One Health, right? The people get it, and I think that's the conversation that they have been trying to have saying that if you want healthy forests also, then you need healthy people, you need healthy wildlife, and you need the harmony of coexistence, where we all recognize the importance of each other, not that wildlife has come, destroyed my crops, I want, and I'm agitated, not like that. It has to be a harmony. So I think the community gets it. I think for us as people who have been trained in a certain way, and I feel very much that, especially here, we are trained in a very rigid way, that we struggle to make sense of conversations. Like how many times, like even as a doctor, how many times would, let's say, an ENT specialist actually talk to a neurologist or a or a urologist and have a conversation where the three of them make sense of each other? We don't. We are happy to get locked away in our specialties. We're getting more niche and niche and niche. And I think that's the challenge that One Health has. It's not about the relevance of it or the importance of it, but it's about how do we implement it and how will we operationalize it. And again, listening to the communities, because I work with the indigenous people, I think therefore listening to and saying that I'm not going to take my broken query building health system and impose it on them. Rather have a conversation of, if we were to move ahead, in a way that they feel that they are better off and the health status also improves, how do we move ahead? So that's your optimism.
Yeah, I'm going to just jump in here a little bit and say something that, in some sense, today's conversation has been focused on forests and wildlife and One Health from the perspective of the balance, right? But we also have to, when we think about One Health, we also have to think about livestock, right? And and zoonosis from livestock, and that might be a place where we could make much more progress, and at least to begin with, and help build towards a concept of One Health, and then also of course be more inclusive and look at wildlife and forests and forest dwellers and so on. So I do think we there are places to start where progress might be a little easier. It's just just a thought there. But, yeah, I think Ramanan Lakshminarayanan will often talk about that if you talk to him about One Health. So
I think from my perspective, panchayats, for example, are probably a good location for One Health. Instead of locating One Health on ground at either in primary health centers or in veterinary centers, panchayats is a good framework. Now, of course, we can talk about how well panchayats function and etc., etc. But panchayats are a very good intersectoral location, and I think and hope that as we move forward in practicing One Health, we must find a good locus, a champion. And I still struggle with who is that One Health champion at taluka level or district level or at village level, and perhaps panchayats is a good locus for One Health. Maybe I'll just, we're almost out of time as I'm told. It's flown past us. Maybe I'll just quickly pose this last question, maybe to you, Chandru, and maybe also throw it up to both Tanya and Prashant. We've talked about data a little bit. We've seen some of these other challenges. We've talked about, the problems of representativeness. And as all scientists, we are striving to get representative data. But when we're asking these big picture questions, how do we do this in that framework that allows us to capture large scale patterns, but not ignore local level processes as well? That, basically we're talking about, I suppose we're also bringing in an equity angle into it. How do we do that in terms of when we're thinking about these data processes and data-driven processes?
Yeah, and I think this is where possibly technology advances now allow us the ability to look at data at gross levels and also at very granular levels, right? And so, earlier, just because it was so much harder to analyze large amounts of data, you would typically aggregate data in some ways, and then disaggregation becomes a challenge. But today there's no limit to what you can do. And if you can zoom down from a map of India all the way to a ward, right? And actually be able to actually pull up data at that ward level and look at it, which is what we have built into the health heat map. I think that's possibly the way we'll have to go, is actually to have that ability to zoom out when we need to and zoom in when we have to.
Great, excellent. You want to have a last point? Very last point. I mean, it has sort of parallels with also what conservation communities talk a lot about, like citizen science. Data. I think, how do you make the data relevant and owned and used by the person creating the data? I think that's where our primary failure has been in health, because we must, because ANMs and ASHAs are data generators. They're not using, and it's not empowering them. Whereas the DCs and the people up are the ones who are getting empowered by all the data, and of course us data scientists, etc. So we need to flip that somehow. Okay. Any last comment from you, Tanya, on this?
I work with this organization, Karna Trust, where during the COVID wave, first wave and second wave, we manage primary health centers across Karnataka and in other states. And in Karnataka, one of the things is we had earlier invested a lot in training these ASHAs and ANMs, and simple things like online courses, platforms, how to engage, how to come into conferences. And that investment really paid off, because when we were saying, okay, guidelines were coming by the minute, and we didn't know how to respond on ground until the guideline came. So we were, sort of stuck there as practitioners. And the beauty was that some of these technologies, we never knew it would be so relevant, right? The online virtual world. And suddenly it just allowed us to listen to voices, allowed us to get data through phone calls. There were WhatsApp groups. People were sending in, okay, here's what's happening on ground. And we were immediately able to process and, get in. So if we're looking for systems, even the investment has to start maybe 10 years before it can make sense. If we're constantly asking outputs or outcomes, impact assessments every year, so that's also a challenge.
Okay. I'm sure we could go on all evening, but I'm informed we have run out of time, and this has been just a fantastic conversation and discussion. It's been very rich, and I want to thank all of you again very, very much, and I'd like the audience to give a big round of applause to our panelists. And I'd also like to give you a small memento of thanks. I think I've stolen your lines. Just wait a minute. This is one of the coffee table books that you can read this. Can't give you guys both the same.
Thank you once again for that insightful discussion, Dr. Chandru, Dr. Seshadri, Dr. Prashant, and Dr. Vanak.
We now move to the memorial lecture segment of the evening. The lecture tonight will be delivered by veterinarian and disease ecologist, Dr. Jonathan Epstein. He is the Vice President for Science and Outreach at the EcoHealth Alliance. His research focuses on the ecology of emerging zoonotic viruses, The goal of his research is to better understand the factors that cause outbreaks of these lethal viruses and to develop strategies that both prevent spillover and protect biodiversity. In 2004, Dr. Epstein was part of a team of scientists that identified horseshoe bats as the natural wildlife reservoir for SARS coronavirus in China. This discovery further highlighted the significance of live animal markets that contain wild animal species, domestic animals, and people as a mechanism for zoonotic disease emergence.
Welcome, Dr. Epstein, and we look forward to learning from your global expertise in One Health surveillance and systems operationalization in developing countries.
Everybody. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you this evening. I'd like to thank Drs. Vanak and Pandit for inviting me to speak with you tonight. What a timely and important topic it is to be speaking about One Health and bringing together the various disciplines in human and animal and environmental health to think about our health and the health of our planet. We're in the midst of a global pandemic that is caused by a bat-borne virus, and we've been put to the test in terms of understanding our relationships with nature. And so tonight I wanted to spend the next few minutes with you talking a little bit about our relationship with nature and how the things that we do as societies, as people, as human beings, the things that we do that change the environment around us really lead to the emergence of diseases like COVID-19 or influenza virus or Ebola virus, all these emerging viruses which tend to originate in animals, particularly wildlife, emerge, have the opportunity to move from the animals that naturally carry them into people because of the things that we do to our environment. And that's really the theme I want to stay with tonight, is how much we influence the opportunities for pandemics to occur. And then we'll talk about solutions and talk about the importance of working within our communities with those on the front lines with the strongest connection to nature that can really be in the best position to prevent pandemics from happening. So with that, I will share my screen and begin. Hopefully you can see my title screen here. And okay. So people, environment, and preventing pandemics. And really the first thing to talk about is the concept or the notion that the majority of diseases that we experience as people are zoonotic, which means that they're transferred or transmitted from animals to people, and in some cases back from people into animals. And this happens and has happened throughout history many more times than we're even aware of. And so if we think conceptually of how outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics, which are simply large-scale regional outbreaks, how pandemics occur, it all begins with bacteria, microbes like bacteria or viruses circulating in animals normally. Okay. Every animal species has its own suite of microbial flora, whether it's viruses or bacteria, and most of these may be benign. Some of them cause disease, which we call pathogens. And any given species interacts with other animals. If you think about ecosystems like a forest or a savanna or a jungle, different animal species come into contact through predator-prey interactions, through connection at food resources or territorial disputes. And every time different animals come into contact, if one of those animals happens to be infected and infectious with a pathogen, there's an opportunity for that pathogen to jump from one species to another. Now, depending on the makeup of the particular virus, and I'm mostly going to be talking about viruses tonight, but depending on the genetic makeup of that virus, it may have the ability to infect a new host or a new species, or it may not. And if not, then that infection will go nowhere. But if that virus is able to infect another species and has the opportunity to make the jump through contact between animals, then it can circulate within a new species. And these kinds of exchanges happen all the time. And the problem is we're just not aware of how often they happen because we're not paying attention to wildlife disease and wildlife populations. It's just not something we've really set up the resources to pay attention to. However, when wild animals come into contact with domestic animals, with our livestock, like cattle or goats and sheep, poultry, And then disease is the result of that interaction. We do tend to notice because we pay careful attention to our livestock. And we don't always know what's causing disease or death in our domestic animals, but in many cases, this may be something new that's been transmitted from a wild animal. That same is true as if when wildlife come into contact with people or domestic animals come into contact with people, there's an opportunity for us to be exposed to viruses that may be circulating in those animals. And again, if that virus is able to successfully infect a person and be transmitted from person to person, then there's the opportunity for an outbreak. And so we see in this conceptual figure, we move from stage 1, which is the interface between animals and people, into stage 2, which is an outbreak in people. And then so much depends on the virus's ability to efficiently spread from person to person, but also the connectivity, how connected human populations are with each other, which helps determine how many people are available to be infected and how big that outbreak may be. Now, most times, particularly in rural areas or remote communities that are living in forests, an outbreak may happen. And because there isn't much connection with other populations, that outbreak will burn itself out. It'll move through the population. People will recover or they may die, but who's left has some sort of immunity. And then that virus kind of fizzles out and goes away. And we saw that often with, for example, classic Ebola virus outbreaks in Central Africa, where remote populations would be infected, presumably from a wild animal. The virus would circulate, about half the people would die, half would survive, and then the virus would run out of people to infect, and the epidemic would naturally end. And of course, when there are public health systems in place that can intervene, outbreaks can be shortened and can be restricted by limiting the movement of people. So this is stage 2. And if we have a virus that is able to efficiently spread among people, like we're seeing with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, which is very efficient, and people are connected, then it has the opportunity to cause a more widespread outbreak. And we move up to stage 3, where of course, these days with global travel, a person and their pathogens can be anywhere in the world within 24 hours. And so we do see a much easier time for viruses to cause pandemics nowadays if they have the ability to do so because of how connected we are globally. And so what I want to focus on today is that if our interest is in preventing pandemics like COVID, like the next COVID, we need to focus our energies and attention in health at stage 1, that interface between people and animals, where those pathogens make the first jump into human populations, because by the time they cause outbreaks, it's already too late. It's so difficult to contain and control infectious diseases once they're already circulating in the community. So our goal must be to prevent that spillover, to limit those opportunities from happening in the first place. Now, the science of predicting and understanding disease emergence has come a very long way in the past 20 years. And we now have a very good understanding of where in the world we're most likely to see new diseases emerge, particularly zoonotic diseases. And this is a map of the world showing emergent disease hotspots, highlighted in yellow. And this was a study done by EcoHealth Alliance, by my organization, and it was published in 2017, originally in 2008. And it really models the predictive factors for disease emergence, including wildlife biodiversity. When there are high areas of biodiversity, we tend to have a lot of different hosts that potentially could be carrying viruses or bacteria that are zoonotic. But importantly, there has to be that convergence of biodiversity, human populations, livestock populations, and the dynamic process of environmental change that brings people and livestock into closer contact with those wildlife. So in an intact forest system where there's high biodiversity, there isn't particularly high risk as long as those animals remain in a stable ecosystem and aren't having high degrees of contact with people or livestock. But as soon as we start to change that environment, that's where diseases have the opportunity to emerge. So we now know statistically where there's the highest likelihood of disease emergence, and we can focus our limited resources globally on really preventing spillover and trying to reduce those opportunities for contact. And we know also very well the major causes, the drivers for emerging diseases to occur. And the number one driver is land use change, responsible for about 1/3 of all emerging diseases. Land use change, which includes deforestation and forest degradation, also includes conversion from forested areas to agricultural areas, or agricultural areas to urban areas, and even urban areas back into agricultural areas or forested areas. It's that dynamic process that, again, disrupts ecosystems and influences the frequency with which people and our domestic animals come into contact with wildlife, particularly if there are wild animal species that tend to carry viruses that have the ability to jump into new hosts like livestock or people. Just to show you an example of how land use change, and particularly deforestation, can influence contact. This is a satellite image of the Brazilian Amazonian rainforest back from 1975. And it's an infrared image. So everything here that is red is actually green in reality, which is forest cover. So we see a very intact forest canopy in the rainforest. If we move ahead 20 years to 1992, we start to see these lines in the image. These are logging roads. These roads are miles and miles long that are cut into the forest to extract timber. Now, what happens when we have deforestation, and particularly with timber harvesting at this scale, is that suddenly there's access into deep parts of the forest where people never used to have access before. And the process of timber harvesting, often people will set up camps inside forests to extract timber. And while they're camping, what do they eat? Wildlife, bushmeat. Okay, oftentimes hunting goes on. So part of this is the process of hunting wild animals, animals that people normally didn't have much contact with. And in the process of butchering those animals, people get exposed to bodily fluids and whatever pathogens those animals may be carrying. And also by virtue of being deep in the forest, people are exposed to insect vectors, mosquitoes, perhaps ticks, where they could be infected by new diseases as well. And as an example of how changes in environment can affect disease transmission, there was a really nice study done out of the University of Wisconsin back in the 2000s looking at malaria transmission in the Amazon. And what they found was that in areas where there were intact rainforest canopy, you had pools of water which were shaded. And those shaded pools of water bred a certain type of mosquito, which was okay at transmitting malaria, but not so great. When the trees were taken away and sunlight began to hit those pools of water, it selected for a different species of mosquito, one that was a better vector, a more competent vector for malaria transmission. And indeed, we saw malaria transmission increase in those forested areas and in human populations once deforestation was occurring. So these are often unintended consequences, but very powerful impacts of environmental change. Now, the second biggest driver of disease emergence is agricultural intensification or livestock production that's intensified, particularly when biosecurity is lacking or absent. Biosecurity means really having barriers between the domestic animals we're raising and people and wildlife that could spread disease to those animals. So it's protecting the health of livestock populations. And a good example of where we saw a disease emerge following the intensification of livestock production was Nipa virus, a virus which has recently been impacting India, but was originally discovered in Malaysia as a disease of pigs and then people. It emerged in 1998 on a large-scale pig farm in northern Malaysia in Ipoh, and it caused a very severe respiratory and neurologic disease in pigs on this farm. And in the process of going through their illness, pigs developed very severe respiratory disease and coughing, and in doing so, we're aerosolizing, we're spreading droplets full of virus, and people working on the farms were getting exposed to the virus and got sick and developed encephalitis or central nervous system disease. And in Malaysia, Nipa virus was spread directly from pigs to people. And it was because of the movement of pigs from a very large farm where it emerged across to other farms. We saw the spread of the disease in people from the northern part of Malaysia down south and into Singapore. And the disease was ultimately contained as farms were depopulated. But it was very clear that transmission was occurring from pigs to people. And in Malaysia, Nipa virus killed about 40% of the people that it infected. Now, how did Nipa virus emerge? There's been pig farming across Malaysia for decades and decades. It had been an industry mostly with backyard farms, small scale farming, maybe a couple dozen pigs, a few hundred head of pigs. But over time, in the 80s and 90s, the demand for pork products and exporting pork products to other parts of Asia grew. And so farming grew and intensified. And the farm where Nipa virus emerged in northern Malaysia was the largest farm of its kind in Malaysia with 30,000 pigs on it. And so here's an aerial view of the farm. And there were pig houses, pig enclosures across the farm. And it was a very industrialized system for pig farming, where one section of the farm had sows giving birth to piglets. Those piglets were then weaned and brought to a separate part of the farm to grow up and get fattened up for market and then moved off. But all the time, new pigs were being born. So this was constant influx of new animals onto the population. And it was very common to have fruit orchards on pig farms as a supplemental form of income. And from this other picture in the inset, you can see that there are mango trees on this farm, and in fact, right up against the pig enclosures. And it was discovered that Nipa virus is actually carried by large fruit bats of the genus Pteropus. These giant flying foxes, as they're called colloquially, are very generalist. They typically will live in the forest and eat figs and nectar from different trees. But given the opportunity, cultivated fruit that we would grow, especially juicy fruits like mangoes, are very attractive to these bats. And so this large mango orchard, literally up against the pig enclosures, was an attractant to many of these bats that flew in. And these bats were the natural reservoir for Nipa virus. They naturally carry it. They don't get sick from it, interestingly, but they shed it in their saliva, their urine, their feces. So these bats were landing on mango trees, eating mangoes and dropping pieces of fruit into the pig enclosure, contaminated with excreta like saliva or urine. And of course, pigs would then come over and eat the fruit that was dropped in there and get exposed occasionally to Nipa virus if a bat was shedding it. And literally hundreds and hundreds of bats, probably per night, were coming in to feed on these trees. So there was lots of opportunity. This was the wildlife-livestock interface that I mentioned earlier. So nothing that would have deliberately happened. Bats were not seeking contact with pigs, but through this accidental exposure via contaminated food, pigs were getting exposed. And similarly, farmers would pick up dropped fruit that bats had bitten into and feed it to their pigs, just as they couldn't sell the fruit, but it was a supplemental form of nutrition for their pigs as well. So that's how Nipa emerged on this farm. And the reason that we didn't see large Nipa outbreaks prior to this is that the pig populations were just too small. So if pigs were getting infected, they would get sick, they would recover. Farmers might never know what made them sick. And if only a few pigs were getting sick at a time and farmers weren't getting exposed, it might never have been diagnosed or recognized. And then Nipa would just burn out and go away on a small population. But with a large industrialized farm like this, enough new pigs were being born into the population that Nipa virus could circulate continuously within this pig farm over a long period of time, infecting people and allowing pigs to be infected when they were then shipped off the farm and moved to other farms where the virus could spread from farm to farm. So it was the intensification without a barrier, without biosecurity, protecting those pigs from wildlife or from contaminated food that allowed Nipa to emerge in the first place. Now, urbanization is another driver of disease emergence. And there are many wildlife species that have become very well adapted to living with people. And many of you may be familiar with macaques, may see them around. They're very good at living among us, whether it's in a city or in a rural community. There are many other examples, but non-human primates, bats, and rodents, categorically, all three of these groups of animals not only do very well in humanized environments, but they tend to carry viruses that are able to be transmitted to people. And so when we have high concentrations of wildlife coming into contact with people, whether people are feeding them directly or indirectly, there's lots of opportunities for contact. And so this is an example, is actually from Bangladesh in Dhaka, where macaques are very prevalent, but people commonly feed them. And that not only increases the population of macaques, but makes macaques very bold, and they consider people a food resource. So we call this wildlife provisioning, and that is the providing of food to wildlife because of human activities, food that wouldn't normally or naturally be available. And it changes the way we come into contact with wildlife. It increases our contact and therefore increases opportunity for disease transmission. Now, other activities that increase our contact with wildlife are bushmeat hunting, and Ebola is a really good example of a zoonotic virus that has repeatedly emerged through the process of hunting. And although we've known about Ebola virus since 1976, and we've seen now more than 50 outbreaks of Ebola in Central and now West Africa, we still have a very limited understanding of its ecology. But the preponderance of scientific evidence right now shows that bats, different species of bats, are the natural reservoir for Ebola and related viruses. And we know that there are other animals, other wildlife that are susceptible to Ebola, particularly great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, and antelope species like duiker. And so in the early and mid 2000s, we had outbreaks of Ebola virus that we witnessed in animal populations and chimpanzees and gorillas, and there was high mortality. And because great apes, we pay careful attention to them because of their status as endangered species and their value in terms of ecotourism to local communities and governments. We pay a lot of attention to the health of great apes. And so there were thousands of animals dying from Ebola outbreaks in the early 2000s, and people as well. And we know about some outbreaks in humans that occurred when hunters went into the forest, harvested or gathered carcasses of animals that had died from Ebola, particularly chimpanzees and gorillas, brought those animals back to the village to eat. And in that process were exposed and infected. And then Ebola was able to infect other people in the village. So we've seen instances of people getting exposed through other infected animals. And there are other outbreaks where it's presumed that people were infected directly by bats, but there's very little evidence. We don't have a good understanding of how that may happen or how other animals are infected, but it may be through the consumption of contaminated fruit, similarly to the Nipa virus story. But for all the historical outbreaks of Ebola, most of them have happened in isolated or remote communities, forested communities, so they've been limited in terms of their size. What we saw in 2014 in West Africa for the first time was a large-scale Ebola outbreak because of a confluence of events. There was a spillover event in West Africa. And what we think we understand is that the first case was a 2-year-old boy who was exposed to some wild animal, presumably a bat, and infected right in Gekido, Guinea, right on the border of Sierra Leone and Liberia. And he was infected. He infected his family. His village had members infected. And this was an area that hadn't really experienced an Ebola outbreak before, or at least hadn't recognized it. And so there was no public health infrastructure to detect and respond to cases of Ebola. And as these infections were happening right on the border area, people were moving across borders that were very porous into the other countries, into Sierra Leone and Liberia. And because roads were very good and because there was a lot of human mobility and connectivity, for the first time in history, Ebola cases made their way to urban centers, to Conakry, to Freetown, to Monrovia. And suddenly there were millions of people available for Ebola to infect. And a large-scale epidemic occurred to the extent of having more than 25,000 cases, about half of whom died. So this was a devastating outbreak. But important to remember is that it all began with a spillover event, a single exposure to animals. And then from there, it was human-to-human transmission through social interactions. So again, spillover and preventing spillover becomes so critically important. And we're starting to get better at becoming aware of how often spillover occurs. And I just wanted to highlight a recent study that we conducted in Southeast Asia and Southern China, looking at populations of people living in proximity to caves that contain horseshoe bats, which are the natural reservoir for SARS and SARS-related viruses, including viruses closely related to SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID. And across this region, we found evidence of exposure, meaning people with antibodies against these type of coronaviruses carried by bats, to the tune of up to 3%, which means that on average, we estimate about 400,000 people every year are infected with SARS-related viruses, with coronaviruses from these bats through various activities, whether it's harvesting guano in a cave or hunting bats, or perhaps other mechanisms we're not aware of. But exposure and potential spillover is happening all the time. And so we really need to understand at community levels, what are the activities that are driving people to have riskier behaviors, to have more frequent exposure. Because while we talk about pandemics like COVID or SARS that potentially have happened in urban centers, maybe in wildlife markets, it's also happening in rural communities all the time. And we're just not paying careful enough attention, nor are we doing enough to try to reduce opportunities for spillover. And so we remain vulnerable to future pandemics like COVID as long as these kinds of exposures are regularly happening. And so really the third biggest driver of disease emergence after land use change and agricultural intensification is wildlife trade. And we talked about bushmeat hunting, and the other side of that coin is really wildlife trade, the commercialized wildlife trade, where we're literally taking animals out of their natural environment, entering them into a commodity chain where they're transported to urban or suburban markets market system where different species of animals have the opportunity to come into contact with many other species of animals they may never come into contact with naturally. And of course, there's opportunities for pathogen exchange. And oftentimes these animals are in highly stressful and unhygienic conditions. They're in crowded cages. They've been transported over land for days. They're stressed. If they're going to be infected with anything, they're certainly going to be shedding it and transmitting it under those conditions. And then, of course, these animals are being handled by people, oftentimes butchered as part of a food system. And so people are coming into contact with bodily fluids and excreta from these animals and literally touching one species and another. So plenty of opportunity for people to be exposed to different animal pathogens as well. And as you can see from this picture, which was taken in the Fushan market where SARS first emerged, a very typical scene would be animals in cages. This boy is looking into a cage full of bats. Notice that he's barefoot. People are eating their lunch. The streets are wet because they've been hosed down to clear off the fur and feathers and blood from having butchered animals. But there's very little sense of hygiene or infection control in many of these live animal markets. And by the way, this is by no means limited to China. Live animal markets occur all over the world, and wildlife hunting occurs all over the world. So these are systems that we need to pay better attention to because they create lots of opportunities for pathogens to jump from one animal to another or from animals into people. And then international travel. We're just more connected today than we ever have been in human history. And this is a map of air routes that's probably even brighter and more intense now than when this figure was created a few years ago. But certainly, and we've seen this with COVID, there's so much connectivity around the world that once pathogens enter into human populations, it's very difficult to contain them, to recognize them early enough. And when you have a disease like COVID that can be transmitted by people without any symptoms, it's even harder to control them. So we have to recognize that it's really too late once diseases are getting into human populations to control them. So I wanted to kind of start to end here by talking about a very specific example that's locally relevant here in India, and that is Nipa virus. And I mentioned it as an example of agricultural intensification, but Nipa is a really important disease in terms of illustrating One Health and the importance of a One Health approach to studying it, to recognizing it, to controlling outbreaks of it, and ultimately to preventing spillover of Nipa virus. Because since Nipa was discovered in 1998 in Malaysia, it's been recognized also as having caused outbreaks of encephalitis and respiratory disease in people in South Asia, particularly in Bangladesh, where since 2001, we've seen almost annual outbreaks of Nipa virus disease in people, but we've also seen sporadic outbreaks in parts of India, in West Bengal, and more recently in Kerala in southern India. And what we understand about Nipa virus in South Asia, just like in many parts of Southeast Asia, is that it's carried by those large fruit bats, Pteropus bats or flying foxes. And there's one species in particular, Pteropus medius, which is common and abundant throughout the subcontinent. Okay, it occurs in rural areas. It's one of those animals that lives very well with people. It's very well tolerated with people. In some areas, it's hunted for food, but by and large, these bats are very well tolerated. And they should be, because these are ecologically very important animals. Fruit bats in general, fruit-eating bats, are crucial in terms of pollinating trees and spreading the seeds of fruit. So they're actually incredibly important to us in terms of protecting rainforest and in pollinating our fruit trees. And so we can't do without these animals, but we now understand that they carry a virus, in this case, Nipa virus and viruses related to it, that occasionally are excreted and can get into people and cause disease. And so this is one that we're paying attention to because we're seeing repeated spillover of Nipa virus. So let's look at the ecology and relationship between people and these bats. This is a typical scene in rural Bangladesh and many parts of India as well, where you have a village, a cluster of houses. You'll have fruit trees that are grown locally to supply local demand for fruit. And you'll have hardwood trees, oftentimes with bat roosts in them. Pteropus bats roost in trees. They're very visible during the day. Most people, if you ask them, have probably seen them in a giant fig tree at the center of the village or in town. And they can roost anywhere from dozens of bats to tens of thousands of bats. Some of the colonies get quite large. And they actually prefer fragmented landscapes. So they do very well in these clumps of trees that are surrounded by villages or even in the middle of cities. And they share food resources with us. These bats will eat about 26 different varieties of fruit that we also eat. And what we understand about Nipa spillover and transmission in Bangladesh is that it's driven by cultivation of date palm sap. This is a traditional practice where date palm trees, the bark is carved off the tree, as you see here. The sap is allowed to flow into these clay pots overnight. And by shaving the bark off trees, it creates this flow of sap. It's a very sweet drink, and people consume it early in the morning. It's collected fresh and distributed door to door by local date palm sap collectors. But what we also have learned is that these bats also enjoy really sweet drinks. They're fruit bats. They like juice. And so they've learned to use date palm sap trees as a food resource, particularly in the winter months when there's little other fruit available. And these infrared images show that bats will come in and lick the flow of sap and oftentimes urinate or defecate into the collecting pots, certainly contaminate the sap with saliva. And every so often, one of these bats is shedding Nipa virus. And so the sap becomes contaminated and people who drink it get infected. And then from there, Nipa is able to spread from person to person. And so we get small scale outbreaks. And what we've learned in trying to understand the patterns of human infection is that these bats carry Nipa virus pretty much everywhere they're found. But Nipa is a pretty rare infection in these bats. So I'll just share with you some results of a study we did over the process of about 10 years, really. But it's a 6-year longitudinal study in Bangladesh that we did from 2007 to 2013. Looking at bats across the country and wondering, why did we only see human cases of Nipa virus in the western part of Bangladesh? All of the outbreaks tended to be clustered in this area of Bangladesh, and they all happened at a certain time of year in the winter from November to April. Now, was this strictly because of date palm sap harvesting and availability? Because date palm sap is harvested in the winter, but date palm sap is not exclusively harvested or cultivated in this part of the country. So did it have something to do with the bats? So we looked into that question. And when we looked at bat colonies across Bangladesh, we saw evidence for infection everywhere we looked in the form of antibodies. So bat colonies had anywhere from 20% to 60% of the bats with antibodies to Nipa, telling us that there was wide distribution and circulation of this virus. And then very importantly, we studied these bats from a single population over a 6-year period, looking at the rate of infection over time. And this was an area that had repeated human outbreaks in Faridpur, Bangladesh. And from about 2006 to 2012, we saw fluctuations in the rate of infection or rate of exposure of these bats to Nipa virus. So this is serologic data, antibody data. But really what this shows, importantly, is that there are periods of time where there are increases in the circulation of Nipa virus based on spikes in exposure in these bats. So sometimes about 80% of the bats had antibodies to Nipa virus, and then sometimes it would drop as low as 20%. So we knew that there were periods when Nipa hadn't been circulating and bats lost immunity at a population level. So we talk a lot about herd immunity when we talk about COVID. Well, that comes from veterinary medicine and animal populations. And so these bats also have herd immunity at a certain level. When enough of them have antibodies, the virus is not present. But when the population level immunity drops to below some threshold, bat populations are vulnerable to an outbreak, and the virus gets reintroduced through the movement of animals, and you get spikes in Nipa circulation, and therefore you get increased shedding or increased opportunity for spillover. So we learned some very important things from studying these bats over time. Number one, we didn't even know that they lost immunity over time. There was a hypothesis that bats once infected with Nipa stayed immune and only got infected once. But we now know that just like people, they lose immunity against diseases, in this case, Nipa, over time. And when they drop below a protective level, they can get reinfected. And that's what was happening in this area that had repeated human outbreaks of Nipa virus. We also saw that there was a big genetic diversity of the virus itself circulating in bats. And although right now Nipa virus does not show the ability to efficiently spread from person to person like COVID does, one of the concerns scientists have is that there is a version, a strain, or a variant of Nipa virus circulating in bats that does have the ability to more easily spread among people. And so we're also studying the genetic diversity of this virus in bats because we really want to get ahead of that possibility. And right now, there is no vaccine and no cure for Nipah virus, although there are vaccines in development. And so we really want to make sure that vaccines in development are effective against different strains of Nipah. And indeed, we see a pretty broad spectrum of genetic diversity of viruses. Now, what about livestock? We started talking about Nipah virus with pigs. And in Bangladesh, there are nomadic pig herds. And the question was, do these pigs play a role in infection? The epidemiologic evidence really showed that people were the main reason that Nipah virus spread, and people got infected by drinking date palm sap. They weren't getting infected from livestock most of the time. It was almost always date palm sap. But when we looked at livestock, we did see evidence for exposure to Nipah or related viruses. So we saw these kind of non-specific antibodies in pigs to the tune of about 44% of them, as well as cattle and goats. So we know that domestic animals can be infected by Nipah and related viruses, but it isn't yet clear, it's not yet apparent that they're playing a role in human infection. But it is something we need to think of, particularly in instances of places like Southern India and Kerala, where we've recently seen infections, people getting infected with Nipah, but we don't yet understand the mechanism of spillover. We know that Pteropus bats are the reservoir in Southern India, just like in Bangladesh. It's the same species of bat, but we don't know how people are coming into contact. Date palm sap isn't harvested in Southern India the way it is in Bangladesh. It could be exposure to dropped fruit. It could be exposure to infected other animals. These are things that need to be investigated and understood so that we can prevent spillover from continuing to happen in Southern India. And one of the successful strategies in Bangladesh that's been working, and why I bring up this as an illustration of a One Health disease, is that the government of Bangladesh has adopted a One Health approach to studying and controlling Nipah virus with integrated surveillance of humans and animals. When human cases are recognized, there's a team that goes out and tests bats and livestock to also understand if they're being infected or if they're infected in the same location. There's active hospital surveillance. When there's an outbreak, it's an integrated approach, human and animal scientists. And also importantly, anthropologists are involved. It's so critical that if we're going to develop interventions to stop spillover, they have to be interventions that are that come with the understanding of local communities and their needs and their behaviors, so that those interventions can be accepted and adopted. They have to be simple and affordable interventions. In the case of Nipah virus in Bangladesh, we've been working with date palm sap collectors to use these bamboo skirts that wrap around the tree and cover the carved part of the bark so that bats can't have access to the sap flow. And that's very effective at creating a barrier for biosecurity, protecting the date palm sap. But interestingly, the reasons that date palm sap collectors are more likely to use these is not to protect health, their health or others. It's because it keeps the sap cleaner and they can sell it for a higher price. And so there's an economic incentive or motivation for doing this behavior. And so this is just one example, but we know that the distribution of bats that carry Nipah and related viruses is vast. It cuts across South Asia into Southeast Asia and Australia. There are parts of Africa where bats carry related viruses, and yet we only see human outbreaks in a limited number of areas. So our concern is that we're missing clusters of Nipah virus in different parts of the world where the bats carry it and people might have exposure. So this is a virus we need to pay better attention to. We need to understand the activities and behaviors of communities that put them at risk for getting Nipah virus, because for every missed outbreak, there's an opportunity for a more transmissible strain of Nipah virus to emerge. And so what do we need to do to really get ahead of emerging diseases? We need to invest in workforce and surveillance infrastructure for zoonotic pathogens. It's really what's missing, particularly in the parts of the world that I mentioned were most vulnerable to disease emergence. We have this continual issue universally, this is true in the United States as well, of government agencies being siloed. They're stuck in their historical limitations of only focusing on human health or livestock health. And wildlife agencies rarely have the capacity to even study wildlife health. And so we really have to start to break down those barriers to have a more integrated and communicative approach to health among different sectors, as well as environmental sectors. And then we need the political will and resources to focus on preventing spillover in the first place, not just investing in drugs and vaccines, although those are very important tools in terms of health, but we have to get further upstream and focus on preventing spillover and outbreak. And one of the ways to do that is working with local communities to understand the high-risk behaviors that occur, understand the needs of those communities, both in terms of health and economics, and try to limit opportunities for exposure. So one example is we created an illustrated book called Living Safely with Bats that we've been using in communities to emphasize, number one, the importance of bats ecologically, but number two, the risks that are associated with coming into contact directly with bats or eating contaminated fruit, just being careful to wash fruit or keep bats out of the household if possible. And so it's this kind of messaging that's developed with input from the community and with a lot of engagement at the local levels to really try to make a change in areas where people are highly exposed. So again, as a global health community, just wrapping up here, we need to do more to identify high-risk interfaces where people and animals are having contact, create physical barriers to improve biosecurity between wildlife and livestock, and our livestock and us, to make sure that we're limiting opportunity for those viruses to jump from species to species. And then something that's very relevant to this evening's discussions about working with remote communities to improve their health security. So much of the high-risk behaviors that occur, so many of these behaviors, whether it's illegal timber harvesting in the forest or bushmeat hunting, have to do with health and economic security in the communities. And there are studies now that have shown that if you improve the health security, basic healthcare needs in rural communities, in indigenous communities, people who have the highest level of contact with animals, if you improve local healthcare needs with clinics and education and provision of medicine, the amount of deforestation, of timber harvesting, and illegal wildlife harvesting drops dramatically. Okay, drops dramatically. So we have to focus at local levels. That is so important, while in parallel working at government levels to create policies that really help us to prevent spillover and reduce high-risk behavior. So in conclusion, people, if there's nothing else I want you to remember, it's that we are the sole reason, really, the main reason that epidemics occur. And it's through activities that we do that change the way we come into contact with wildlife, land use change, livestock intensification, production, and wildlife trade. And as the human population continues to grow and our demand for animal protein and for natural resources increases, we're going to have to figure out ways to do things smarter, to do the things we do that decrease our risk of exposure to animal viruses, not increase our risk. So we need to support One Health research and policies, strengthen surveillance and response systems globally that combine and integrate human and animal responses. And we need to strengthen our community health in order to reduce those high-risk behaviors that put people into contact with animal pathogens. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to conversation and questions. And thank you again for having me this evening.
For sharing that insight into One Health, and in particular, the links between livelihoods, biodiversity, and the risk of emerging zoonoses. I request Dr. Vanak to join us on stage once again for a quick Q&A session with Dr. Epstein. Meanwhile, if any audience member has a question, please raise your hand. We would request our virtual audience to enter their questions into the Q&A box, and we will pass on the questions.
Thank you, Namrata, and thank you, John, for that excellent lecture. And I liked it. It sort of really flowed from the previous panel discussion that we had, the links from public health at the local level to these global scales. So I'm going to see if there are any questions out there in the audience. We have I'm not sure if you can see, but we have a pretty packed hall here.
So can I ask?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you for the wonderful talk. I have a couple of questions. I'll try to keep it short. First one is, when we were looking at the different animals through which these viruses were spreading, my first question was, are there studies that are also looking at street dogs or dogs in general? Because I am a bat enthusiast and researcher. So when I was doing some of my surveys in vineyards in the city where I come from, bats that get trapped, mostly fruit bats that get trapped in these nets that they put out, people either feed them to the street dogs, or some of them believe that it's a cure for fits, so they fry them up for their children. So if we are, testing for antibodies in people and other animals, I was wondering if there are any studies that are also looking at street dogs, because I was wondering that could be something that could be added to the list. And number two, when I was studying, when I was doing these surveys for vineyards and crop raiding by bats, vaguely put, a lot of research that I came across, some of the methods to avoid crop damage that I had come across was planting prominent fruit trees around these vineyards or any other orchards that could act as a buffer or other main attraction to fruit bats, so that the main crop does not get damaged as much. So I would like to know about your opinion on this one particular strategy that is actually very widely stated in a lot of these crop damage literature across.
Thank you.
So yeah, that's it.
John?
Great. Well, excellent questions. To address the issue of dogs, dogs are really important to look at. I agree with you. They're, street dogs effectively are like wild animals in that they're free ranging. They move about freely, and there's plenty of exposure to people. And while the primary disease concern historically has been rabies with street dogs, they are in a lot of contact with wildlife. Particularly, they'll often eat wildlife like bats that are sick and injured on the ground and might be at higher risk for exposure. Now, we know dogs can be infected with Nipa virus, although I don't think that they get sick from it. But there are studies that have shown that they have antibodies to Nipa-related viruses. So it would be worth understanding better what other potential zoonotic viruses dogs are being exposed to. And I think, serology studies would be very important for that. So while I'm aware of limited studies in dogs, there certainly aren't enough, and they should be included in that kind of One Health spectrum of research. So I appreciate your comments. Secondly, in terms of techniques for keeping bats away from primary crops, there are studies undergone now being undertaken to planting natural forage in Australia, eucalypt trees and other trees whose flowers these bats use for nectar, to try to restore some habitat and spread them out a bit more instead of them always aggregating around limited food resources. And that's starting to be shown to be effective in terms of replanting and reforesting. So the idea of putting another crop as a lure can work in a sense, but it's also something that needs to be paid attention to, because you might actually be attracting more bats to the area by planting these larger orchards. Even if the primary goal is to keep them away from one crop, it might cause them to aggregate in an area that could unknowingly create more risk for exposure. So I think that as long as the community is aware of the practice and the strategy, and generally is, there's an education campaign for people not to pick up dropped fruit and eat it, or not to go underneath these colonies of bats or areas where they're feeding, then that could be an effective strategy for protecting crops. We just have to be aware that, we're drawing bats in by creating a food resource for them as well.
Thank you, John. That's excellent question. Combines dogs and bats. Wonderful. We have a question online as well, and I'm gonna quickly read that out. So we have a question from Harshit Mishra, who asks, what kind of measures are being taken or will be taken by nations to identify potential new disease-causing microbes, ones we do not suspect as of now, i.e. how do we identify a microbe as a potential candidate for a disease outbreak when found in a tourist? What are the criteria for this? So that's the question online.
It's a terrific question. There have been efforts on many fronts globally to get a better handle on the types of microbes, viruses particularly, that are circulating in wildlife and that may have spilled over into people and livestock. And I'll give you an example. I was involved in a 10-year project that was funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, called PREDICT. And we were working in 30 different countries, including in India. We were in northern India. And we were studying different viruses using techniques, laboratory techniques that would broadly detect different types of viruses in wildlife. And we were focused on bats and rodents and non-human primates. And we didn't, we discovered 1,000 new viruses, but we only had a very limited understanding of whether any of these were actually zoonotic. So in other words, you might find new viruses, but not really understand if they have the ability to cause disease in other animals or people. So we start to develop strategies for making educated guesses about that. When you discover new pathogens, do they pose a risk or a threat? And one of the ways we do that is by seeing whether the same viruses turn up in different species, or we find them in different rodent species or bats, as well as some cattle, as well as perhaps non-human primates. And when we start to see the same virus present in different animal species, it gives us a sense that that virus has the genetic ability to infect a broad range of hosts that might include people. And so that's one way we can infer whether a virus is zoonotic. We also look at its relationship to known zoonotic viruses already known to be able to infect people and cause disease, like Nipa virus or Ebola virus. And by looking at the family tree of viruses and seeing how closely it relates, it gives us some ability to understand that. Now, you mentioned, what if something is found in a tourist, and does that pose a threat for outbreaks? Well, certainly if something is already found in a person, then it has the ability to infect that person. And we need to better understand whether it caused disease. And we need to have the ability, meaning we need to have laboratories available that can diagnose that virus in other people if they present to a clinic with similar symptoms, or if they've been in contact with that person that's had it. So that's where surveillance systems become crucial. When you identify a person that's infected with something particularly new, you have to trace contacts, and you have to have the ability to recognize whether other people are also infected with that virus. And so that becomes an important part of the process, is building that capacity within public health systems.
Thank you, John. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, then I've got one last question that I'm going to allow from online because we run out of time. Siam Krishnan PA wants to know, since we were talking about interrelationships between public health and planet's health, can we talk about learning from the guardians of nature, the indigenous tribes? Are there attempts to make a database of indigenous medicines and health systems? And can we try to adapt these to public health care? What are the challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there are certainly anthropologists who have spent entire careers trying to document health practices in indigenous populations. And it's not my area of expertise, but I think that that's really important to understand. Some areas of traditional medicine are grounded in generations of experience, and it's worth understanding those. And so right now, I think there's still a bit of a disconnect between traditional medicine and Western medicine, but there's certainly people studying indigenous practices and to understand whether those techniques can be translated. So I think it's an important thing to pay attention to. But similarly, we also have to pay attention to, traditional practices that might actually increase risk of infection. Someone mentioned earlier that I think the first question, that bats are sometimes used to treat asthma or fits or different disease states. And so this is a commonly held belief across many cultures. But the act of hunting bats and using them for traditional medicine might actually put people at more risk for infection of viruses. So we also have to be careful to think carefully about which traditional practices might be beneficial and which might actually increase our contact with wildlife in ways that put us at risk.
Thank you, John. I'm afraid we've run completely out of time. I want to take this opportunity to thank you once again for that amazing talk. I'm sure everyone here has learned quite a lot about the challenges that we face and about these interrelationships. I will end here now, and I will hand back to Anuja. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
With this, as we wrap up the evening, I would like to invite Mr. Rajiv Khoshoo to present the vote of thanks. Mr. Khoshoo is the Senior Vice President of Siemens USA. He is also a member of the A-Tree Advisory Board and Chair of the T.N. Khoshoo Award Committee. Is he all right?
Can you hear me okay?
Mr. Khoshoo, over to you.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I'd like to, the vote of thanks, I'd like to begin with thanking Nitin Pandit to help organize this excellent event. When the idea of zoonotics as a theme was served up by Nitin, my initial response was, oh my God, don't we have enough bad news on COVID already? Can we please focus on hope? And that's exactly what happened today. Ironically, Abhi asked the panelists, give me some hope. I'll give you a little bit of a statistic on that. And of course, what a fantastic keynote by John. It gave us a 360 view and tremendous education. I'd like to recognize Dr. Bava first. Dr. Khoshoo would always tell me to watch Dr. Bava and the success he will have in his career. A true prediction that has absolutely come to life. I know Dr. Bava from my kindergarten days in post-independence India. Even at that age, there were meetings at our home where Dr. Khoshoo would meet these excellent students, and I would gather a lot of education even at that young age. One of the elements of this education I remember today after listening to Tanya and Prashant is embodied by Rabindranath Tagore's poem. I'd like you to imagine a 5-year-old being explained this poem, which I will read, short poem, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arm towards perfection, where clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert of dead habit, where the mind is led forward into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom my father led my country awake. This is how I grew up with Dr. Bava and my father in post-independent India, where there was tremendous hope. And clearly, if you look at what comments Tanya and Prashant made, what caught my ear was new way to do science. What I think they were talking about was ground up from community, collaborative achievements, pull ecosystem, as we call it in business here, rather than a push ecosystem, or we also call it a network effect. And that's what marks a successful achievement, is when you have these elements playing together. Working across sectors, this idea of multi-domain. And then finally, I think it was Tanya or Prashant said something about what makes sense. Then the panel discussion, Abhi served up the topic of Veer Das and his 2 Indias. And which Tanya responded by saying, we have hundreds of Indians. Even in the USA today, we talk of 2 USAs. We have actually under those 2 USAs a whole taxonomy. So it's not any different. And in fact, we should thank Veer Das to get this conversation started, because this idea, what Tanya said, listening to many voices, and Prashant talked about frameworks, right? Chandru talked about technology and its role. Was glad to hear that technology is not the end, but a means. I am in the tech business, very much so, and many times, most of the times, we significantly overestimate the role of technology in the short term, but significantly underestimate its role in the long term. Great discussion on data, both in academics and business, is a contemporary topic. The critical element is not data. The critical element is insights we need from it. And that's how you have to look at data. I think somebody mentioned health is a fundamental right. I think Tanya was mentioning about health is a fundamental right, while it's also very relevant to other debate that's going on in the US today. In the end, Abhi said to the panelists, give me some hope. I just Googled it while I was listening. I got 11 billion hits in 0.68 seconds. So somebody can make a whole career out of chasing these 11 billion hits on Google on Give Me Hope. So with that, I'd like to formally thank everybody for a great event. And of course, to Dr. Epstein for a phenomenal education that I got on zoonotic diseases. And I stand corrected that Nitin did really provide some hope in this and not just bad news that we have had for COVID. Thanks a lot. You guys have a good evening. It's very early morning here in Southern California. So I got up at 2 a.m. today to be part of this. I enjoyed every minute of it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us in celebrating the winners of the 18th edition of the T.N. Khoshoo Memorial Award. Special thank you to Gautam and Shiv for all the tech coordination, and of course our volunteers for taking care of the logistics and ensuring the event runs smoothly.
We hope to see you all at our A3 at 25 celebration in the upcoming year. Have a good night and stay safe. I request all of you to please exit from the door on my left, and our volunteers should assist if there's anything to be done. Thank you.